There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a room once everyone in it has fallen asleep. You have felt it. The hush of a house at rest, the small sounds a body makes when it finally lets go of the day. Tonight we are going to sit inside that quiet together and look at something strange hiding inside it. Something that for a long time no doctor, no scientist, and no grieving family could explain. For most of human history, going to sleep was considered one of the safest things a person could do. And then in certain places, at certain times, that stopped being true. Healthy men and women, some of them young, some of them strong, would lie down at the end of an ordinary evening and simply never wake again. No wound, no illness, no warning. Whatever took them did its work quietly in the dark while the people who loved them slept only a few feet away. Picture a small apartment on the edge of an American city in the early 1980s. It is late autumn and the building is the kind that holds the cold a little too well. So a space heater hums in the corner of the front room. A man in his early 30s lives here with his wife and their 2 children. He's been in this country only a few years. Before that there was a war, a mountain crossing on foot, a refugee camp, years of waiting. Here, finally, there is a small, steady job, a rented apartment, a kitchen that smells of the food his mother used to make. His wife notices in the days before that he has seemed uneasy at night. He mentions a bad dream, something pressing on his chest, a shape at the foot of the bed that he cannot quite describe in the language he is still learning. She tells him to rest. He is young. He is careful with his health. There is no reason for either of them to be afraid. He goes to bed at the usual hour, sometime before morning, without a sound loud enough to wake anyone else in the apartment. His heart simply stops. There is no cry, no struggle that anyone hears, no fall, nothing broken. His wife wakes at dawn to a stillness that will not lift. When the coroner examines his body in the days that follow, there is nothing there. No blocked artery, no poison, no injury, no disease that anyone can name. A man in good health has died in his sleep, and the record will show in the coldest and most honest language available that the cause of death is unknown. I was not the only one. Across a handful of years, in cities scattered from California to Minnesota, a small number of men from the same community, most of them Hmong refugees who had recently arrived from Southeast Asia, died in almost exactly this way. Young, outwardly well gone before sunrise, with autopsies that offered no answer at all. It happened rarely enough that most of the country never heard about it, and often enough that within these communities people began to whisper that something was hunting them, specifically something that knew how to find them only when they slept. What actually killed these men would take medical science years to even begin to understand, and the explanation, when it finally arrived, would reach far beyond one refugee community and into a mystery that stretches back centuries. Because this was not the first time in history that people had died this way. Long before modern medicine, long before anyone had a word for a heart's electrical rhythm, cultures on nearly every continent had their own name for the thing that could climb onto a sleeping chest and simply stop a life. They called it different names in different languages, described it in different shapes, and each time the descriptions were strangely unsettlingly similar. A weight, a presence, a paralysis that arrived just before death, or sometimes just before something worse than death was still understood to be. Tonight we are going to follow that thread all the way through. We will sit with the fear that spread through immigrant communities in 1980s America, watch doctors chase an invisible killer that left no trace, and trace the folklore of the night hag and the sleeping demon, back through centuries of European, African, and Asian belief, all of it circling the same terrifying, very real question: what is it that can reach into a sleeping body and simply stop the heart? By the end, we will arrive at an answer that took modern medicine decades to find hidden inside the wiring of the human heart itself, and we will understand why some of the oldest nightmares in human history were never just nightmares at all. Before we go further into it, if this is the kind of history you've been looking for, something real told slowly and without needing to shock you, it would mean a great deal if you took a moment to subscribe and leave the video a like. It helps this kind of storytelling reach the people who are looking for exactly this. And if you have a moment, leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from tonight and what drew you to this particular story. I always read them, and I love knowing who is out there in the quiet with me. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let us begin. The story does not start in that apartment in the early 80s, and it does not start with any single family or any single loss. It starts much earlier in the long human habit of being afraid of the dark, and in the much older, much stranger question of what exactly happens to a person's body and mind in the hours when they are least able to protect themselves. To understand what happened to that small grieving community of refugees, and to understand why doctors were so completely unprepared for what they were seeing, we first have to go back and sit with the oldest version of this fear. The one that has been told around fires and whispered in bedrooms for as long as people have been falling asleep at all. The word nightmare itself is older and stranger than most people realize, and it did not always mean a bad dream. In Old English, a mare was not a horse at all, but a specific kind of spirit, a malevolent presence believed to sit on a sleeper's chest in the dead hours of the night and press the breath out of them. Night plus mare. A nightly visitation, not a metaphor. For the people who first used the word, this was not poetry, it was a diagnosis. Across medieval Europe, this experience had a remarkably consistent shape no matter which village or which century you happen to ask about. A person wakes or seems to wake and finds that they cannot move. Their eyes may be open, the room around them entirely familiar, and yet their limbs will not answer them. Something is in the room, they are certain of it, and more than that, something is on them, a crushing weight pressing down on the chest, making each breath a small desperate victory. In parts of Germany, this presence was called the Alp. In Slavic folklore, it took the form of the Mora, a wandering female spirit said to slip through keyholes to reach her victims. In Newfoundland fishing villages, sailors and their families spoke for generations of the old hag. A figure who would climb onto a sleeper in the night and ride them, leaving them exhausted and shaken by morning, unable to explain what exactly had happened, only that it had felt entirely stable. Take a bleeper. What makes this worth pausing on is not simply that so many unconnected cultures invented similar monsters. It is that the physical description these cultures gave independently, without contact with one another, matches almost exactly a real neurological state that modern sleep science would not properly understand until the 20th century. The paralysis, the crushing pressure on the chest, the certainty of a malevolent presence in the room, the inability to scream. These are not simply the ingredients of folklore. They're, as we will come to see, the ingredients of a specific and very real transitional state between sleep and waking. 1. The human brain has clearly been slipping into for as long as there have been humans to slip. But the old hag and her many cousins across the world were not always understood as harmless if terrifying visitors. In some traditions, the visitation was believed capable of killing outright. This is where the folklore stops being merely eerie and starts brushing up against something closer to what we are actually here to understand tonight. In Southeast Asia, and specifically within Hmong communities whose beliefs we touched on only briefly before, there exists a spirit known as the Dabtsog. Descriptions of the Dabtsog, gathered by anthropologists working with Hmong elders in the decades before and after their displacement from Laos, describe a squat, heavy presence that settles onto a sleeper's chest during the night, pinning them in place, sometimes appearing in the shape of a large cat or a shadowed figure crouched low to the ground. Victims who survived an encounter, and most did, described waking in a state of complete paralysis, aware of their surroundings, unable to cry out, with a crushing sensation across the chest that some likened to being sat on by something enormous. Crucially, and this matters for where our story is going, the Dabet Sog was not considered simply frightening. Within traditional Hmong cosmology, it was understood as something that could, on rare occasions, actually take a life. A visitation that went badly enough, that lingered long enough, that found a person unprotected in exactly the wrong way, could end in death before morning. This was not treated as superstition in the way a modern Western audience might assume. It was treated the way any community treats a known, if rare, danger. There were precautions. There were prayers said before sleep meant to keep the spirit away. There were objects placed near beds and rituals passed down through families, quiet and practical, the way a coastal family might teach their children to respect the tide. It would be easy, hearing all this, to file it away as simply a colourful piece of folklore, interesting but ultimately separate from the real medical mystery we opened with in that apartment in the early 1980s. And for a long time that is more or less what Western medicine did. But the evidence remains incomplete on exactly how much these older beliefs shaped what happened next and how much they simply ran parallel to it. Because when Hmong refugees began arriving in the United States in large numbers in the years following the end of the war in Southeast Asia, they carried this cosmology with them fully intact into a country that had absolutely no framework for taking it seriously. Understanding what these families had already survived matters here, and it is worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past. Many of the men and women who would eventually settle in cities like Fresno, Minneapolis and Providence had spent years as allies of American forces during the conflict in Laos, fighting a war that their new country would later be reluctant to fully acknowledge. When that war ended in defeat, entire families fled on foot through dense jungle, crossed the Mekong River under fire, and spent months or years in crowded refugee camps in Thailand before resettlement agencies scattered them across an unfamiliar country thousands of miles from their mountains, their ancestors, their language, and everything that had once made a house feel safe enough to sleep in. It is against this backdrop, uprooted, grieving, adjusting to cold climates and fluorescent-lit apartments and jobs that bore no resemblance to the agricultural life. Many of them had known that a small but consistent number of Hmong men, almost always in their 30s or younger, began to die in their sleep. The pattern was strange enough on its own, but what unsettled the communities affected even more than the deaths themselves were the accounts given quietly by surviving family members of what had happened in the hours before. Again and again, wives and mothers described the same warning signs their husbands and sons had mentioned in passing during the days leading up to their deaths. A heaviness at night, a shape at the foot of the bed, a pressure on the chest that would not lift. The dabbed sog, many of them said plainly, had come for their men, and this time it had not let go. American doctors, when they eventually became aware of this pattern, had no idea what to do with any of this. Some dismissed the accounts entirely, treating them as folk explanation layered over what must surely be an undiscovered medical cause. Others found themselves uncomfortably unable to offer any medical cause at all, which left the folklore standing as the only explanation anyone could actually point to. Autopsy after autopsy came back clean. No poison, no blocked artery, no sign of violence, no infection, nothing that would explain why a healthy young man had simply stopped breathing sometime between midnight and dawn. We will spend real time with those investigations, and with the men and women both inside and outside the Hmong community, who spent years trying to understand what was actually happening in these bedrooms. But it is worth carrying this thought forward with us now into the next part of the story, because it is easy to assume that folklore and medicine sit on opposite sides of a hard, clean line, one built from superstition, the other from evidence. What happened to these families suggests something quieter and more unsettling than that. Sometimes an old story survives for centuries not because people are gullible, but because it is describing something real, something the people who lived closest to it noticed and named long before anyone had the instruments to prove them right. By the summer of 1981, a small number of physicians scattered across the country had begun independently to notice the same unsettling pattern in their own case files. A death certificate with no clear cause. A young, healthy man of Southeast Asian descent. A family too grieved and too unfamiliar with the American medical system to push hard for answers that did not seem to exist anyway. On their own, each case looked like a tragic anomaly, the kind of unexplained death that occurs rarely in any population. It was only when these physicians began comparing notes almost by accident at conferences and in scattered phone calls that the true shape of what was happening started to come into focus. The man credited with first pulling these threads together was a doctor working with refugee health programs who began noticing a troubling number of similar cases moving across his desk from clinics in different states. What he found when he started actively gathering reports rather than waiting for them to arrive, by coincidence, unsettled him. Between 1977 and the mid-1980s, well over 100 otherwise healthy Southeast Asian refugees, the overwhelming majority of them Hmong men, had died suddenly in their sleep on American soil, with autopsies that consistently found nothing. Not a heart attack in the conventional sense, not a stroke, not any of the usual explanations a coroner reaches for when a young body simply stops. The Centers for Disease Control eventually took formal notice, launching an investigation into what researchers began calling, with a kind of clinical caution that could not quite hide their unease, sudden unexpected nocturnal death syndrome. What made the pattern especially difficult to dismiss was its narrowness. This was not simply an elevated rate of sudden death across a broad population. It was concentrated almost entirely within one specific community, largely among men, largely among those in early adulthood, and largely, though not exclusively, among the Hmong, rather than other Southeast Asian refugee groups who had endured comparably difficult journeys to the same country. Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees who had lived through their own devastating wars and displacements simply were not dying at anything close to the same rate in the same manner in the same years. Whatever this was, it appeared to be reaching for a very specific population in a very specific place at a very specific moment in time, and that specificity is exactly what made it so difficult for investigators to explain away as coincidence. And so difficult, frankly, for them to explain at all. Investigators pursued nearly every avenue available to them. They considered toxic exposure testing for pesticide residue and industrial contaminants in case something in these families' new American environments, their apartments, their workplaces, their food was quietly poisoning them. They considered infectious disease hunting for a virus or parasite that might have travelled with the refugees from Southeast Asia and simply taken years to manifest. They considered genetic predisposition, wondering whether something inherited within Hmong bloodlines might make hearts more vulnerable under stress. Each avenue was investigated with real seriousness, and each one in turn failed to produce a conclusive answer. No consistent toxin, no shared pathogen, no single genetic marker that could account for the pattern on its own. It is worth pausing here on a detail that rarely makes it into the medical literature, but appears again and again in the oral histories gathered from surviving family members during this period, because it is the kind of detail that complicates any simple narrative. Investigators noticed that the deaths seemed to cluster disproportionately in the early months after a family's resettlement, often within the first year or two of arriving in the United States, and that they seemed to occur more frequently among men who had reported significant psychological distress sleep, disturbances, and what clinicians at the time were only beginning to understand as symptoms of severe unaddressed trauma. Grief counselors working with these communities in the early 1980s described men who had lost parents, siblings, and children during the war and the escape that followed, who were now living in cramped apartments in their unfamiliar cities, working night shifts in unfamiliar languages, carrying a grief that their culture had specific structured ways of processing, back home ways that simply did not exist or could not be practiced in their new surroundings. This raised an uncomfortable, delicate question that researchers at the time were not fully equipped to answer, and that scholars still debate today. Could profound psychological trauma alone, without any underlying physical vulnerability, actually stop a healthy human heart? It sounds on its face like exactly the kind of folk explanation that a rigorous medical investigation would set aside in favor of harder evidence. And yet the timing was difficult to ignore. Family members frequently described their loved ones as men who had in the weeks before their deaths become visibly withdrawn, sleeping poorly, speaking of vivid and disturbing dreams, sometimes explicitly describing visitations from the Dabzog we sat with earlier, and sometimes simply describing an overwhelming, wordless dread they could not shake as evening approached. Whether this distress was itself a symptom of an undiagnosed physical condition already beginning to make itself known, or whether it was a separate, purely psychological burden that happened to coincide with these deaths, is a question the historical record cannot fully settle, and it is one worth sitting with rather than resolving too quickly. There is a particular kind of evidence that becomes available to researchers only when they are willing to listen carefully to a community, rather than simply study it from the outside, and this is precisely what happened next. Anthropologists working alongside the medical investigators began interviewing Hmong elders, shamans, and family members, not to collect folklore as colour for a report, but as a genuine source of data about what these men had actually experienced before they died. What emerged from those interviews was strikingly consistent. Many of the deceased had in fact sought help before their deaths not from American doctors whom they often distrusted or could not afford to see, but from traditional healers within their own community, who performed protective rituals intended specifically to keep the Dabzog away. In some cases, these rituals appear to work at least for a time. In others, they clearly did not. What this tells us, and what makes this particular chapter of medical history so quietly remarkable, is that an entire community had already developed its own detailed, internally consistent framework for identifying, describing, and attempting to prevent a phenomenon that American medicine, with all its instruments and laboratories, could not yet even name. The elders were not confused about what was happening. They had a taxonomy for it, a set of warning signs, a set of interventions, refined over generations. What they lacked was not understanding, but the specific tools required to translate that understanding into a language. The American medical establishment would recognize as evidence rather than superstition. It would take several more years, several hundred additional pages of case files, and one crucial, almost unrelated discovery on the other side of the world before anyone would begin to close the gap between what the Hmong elders already knew and what Western cardiology could actually prove. That discovery, when it finally arrived, would not come from a refugee community in America at all, but from a hospital in Europe, where a set of parents brought in their own child with a family history that, once examined closely, would begin to unlock everything. Long before the Centers for Disease Control ever opened a file on Hmong refugees in the American Midwest, doctors on the other side of the Pacific had already been quietly documenting something remarkably similar decades earlier, in a population that had nothing obvious in common with them except geography and, as it would turn out, biology. In the Philippines, going back at least to the early years of the 20th century, physicians and village healers alike had a name for it. They called it Bangungut, a word that roughly translates to rising and moaning in sleep, and it described exactly what it sounds like. A person almost always a man, almost always young and outwardly healthy, would go to bed after an ordinary evening and be found dead by morning. Sometimes after family members in the next room reported hearing him groan or gasp in the night as though struggling against something they could not see. Filipino medical journals from as early as the 1917 carry case reports of bangungut, treating it not as folklore but as a recognized if mysterious category of death. One common enough that rural communities develop their own precautions around it, much the way Hmong families would later develop precautions against the dabiitsog. The Philippines was not alone. In Japan, physicians had long used the term pokkuri, meaning something close to sudden death without warning, to describe an almost identical phenomenon, one appearing predominantly in young and middle-aged men striking during sleep, leaving no trace on autopsy. Thailand had its own name for it, Tu Lai Thai, and its own body of folklore describing a spirit that visited sleeping men in the night. What is worth sitting with here is not simply that these countries each had their own word for sudden nocturnal death. It is that they were geographically and culturally remarkably close to one another, clustered across a swath of Southeast Asia that stretched from the Philippines through Thailand and into Laos, the very region the Hmong had called home for generations before the war scattered them halfway around the world. There is a detail buried in the American medical record that very few people outside of cardiology history ever encounter, and it deserves more attention than it has generally received. In the 1940s, decades before the Hmong crisis, American public health officials had already documented a strikingly similar pattern among Filipino immigrant laborers working in the American Midwest, men who had come to the United States for agricultural and cannery work and who were, with unsettling regularity, found dead in their sleep with no discoverable cause. At the time, these deaths were noted, briefly studied, and then largely forgotten, filed away as an oddity of an immigrant population rather than recognized as a thread in a much larger, much older pattern that stretched across an entire region of the world and, as we would eventually learn, across an entire category of the human heart. Why a discovery sitting in plain sight for 40 years failed to connect itself to the crisis unfolding among Hmong refugees is itself a small tragedy of medical history, one born less of incompetence than of how easily knowledge can scatter and go quiet when no one is listening for the pattern across cultures rather than within just one. It would take a family in Europe entirely unconnected to Southeast Asia to finally force cardiology to take the pattern seriously. In the late 1980s, two brothers, Pedro and Josep Brugada, both cardiologists working in Belgium and Spain, began treating a young family whose history unsettled them in a way few cases had before. The parents had already lost one child to sudden unexplained death in early childhood. A second child in the family had suffered repeated episodes of cardiac arrest, the heart simply stopping and having to be shocked back into rhythm again and again with no structural damage, no blockage, nothing a scalpel or a scan could locate. What the brothers eventually noticed poring over the family's electrocardiograms with the kind of patience that good diagnostic medicine actually requires was a specific distinctive pattern in the heart's electrical signature, a particular shape in the readout that did not match any previously catalogued heart condition. It was subtle. On some days, in some recordings, it barely showed up at all. But it was there consistently enough, in this family and as they would soon discover in others. In 1992, the Brugada brothers published their findings describing what they had identified as a distinct clinical syndrome, one in which the heart's electrical wiring carries a hidden vulnerability, often invisible on a resting electrocardiogram, that under certain conditions can trigger a sudden chaotic heart rhythm, capable of stopping the heart entirely in an otherwise structurally normal organ. The condition would come to bear their name, Brugada syndrome, and crucially, And this is the detail that would eventually connect a Belgian cardiology paper to a refugee community in Minnesota and a folk spirit in the mountains of Laos. The syndrome appeared to be far more common and far more dangerous in certain populations than in others. Here is where the evidence remains incomplete in a way that is honestly worth naming rather than smoothing over. Brugada syndrome is now understood to be significantly more prevalent among populations of Southeast Asian descent than among populations of European descent, and researchers still do not fully agree on precisely why certain genetic variants linked to the condition became more established in some regions of the world than others. Some researchers point to specific founder mutations, genetic changes that arose generations ago within particular populations and then persisted generation after generation through ordinary inheritance. Others suspect the picture is more complicated, involving multiple contributing genetic variants working in combination rather than a single clean genetic switch. What nearly everyone in the field agrees on, however, is the striking geographic and ethnic distribution the condition shows, a distribution that maps with real precision onto exactly the regions where Bangungut Pokri Lai Tai and the deaths inside Hmong refugee communities had all independently been observed for generations. Is it possible that an entire scattered set of folk explanations developed independently across the Philippines, Japan, Thailand and Laos, each with their own name, their own spirit, their own protective ritual, had all in their own way been describing the same underlying electrical flaw in the human heart centuries before anyone possessed the equipment to actually see it? The question sits differently once you know the geography lines up as closely as it does. None of this, it is worth saying, clearly means these communities somehow already understood cardiac electrophysiology, or that the Dabtsug and Brugada syndrome are simply two names for the same tidy fact. Folklore is never that clean, and neither is genetics. What these traditions had actually built over generations of quiet, careful observation was something more modest and in some ways more remarkable. A reliable early warning system, a way of recognizing a real, recurring pattern of death long before anyone had the language of chromosomes and ion channels to explain what was actually happening beneath the skin. They were not wrong that something dangerous visited certain families in the night more often than pure chance would predict. They simply had no way yet of knowing that the visitor lived inside the heart itself and had likely lived there for generations, passed quietly down a family line long before anyone in that family had ever heard the word syndrome. What remained as the 1990s began and cardiologists slowly started connecting Brugada's European findings back to the still unsolved American refugee cases was the harder, more delicate work of actually proving the link family by family, autopsy by autopsy, and understanding exactly what it was about sleep itself, about the particular hours between midnight and dawn that made this hidden flaw in the heart's wiring choose that moment again and again to finally make itself known. Sleep, it turns out, is not the passive restful state most of us imagine it to be while we are lying inside it. The heart does not simply slow down and wait patiently for morning. It moves through distinct active phases each night, and one of the most important shifts happening inside a sleeping body involves a quiet, largely invisible tug of war between two branches of the nervous system, one that speeds the heart along and one that pulls it back. Understanding that tug of war turns out to be essential to understanding why so many of the deaths we have been following happened specifically at night and specifically in the deepest, stillest hours before dawn, rather than during the ordinary stress of a waking day. The nervous system that keeps a heart beating without any conscious effort on our part splits broadly into two competing forces. One, called the sympathetic system, is the accelerator, the part responsible for the racing heart of fear or exertion. The other, called the vagal or parasympathetic system, is the brake, the part that slows the heart during rest, digestion, and above all sleep. During the deepest stages of nighttime sleep, vagal tone rises considerably, the heart's natural braking system, leaning in more heavily than it does at almost any other point in a person's day. For the overwhelming majority of people, this is simply what healthy rest looks like, a gentle protective slowing. But for a heart carrying the specific electrical vulnerability we have been tracing back through Belgium and the Philippines and the mountains of Laos, that same nighttime slowing can act less like a break and more like a trigger, nudging an already unstable electrical rhythm into chaos at precisely the moment a person is least able to notice or respond to what is happening inside their own chest. This single physiological detail, once cardiologists fully grasped it in the years following the Brugada brothers' initial discovery, went a long way toward explaining a pattern that had puzzled investigators since the earliest Hmong refugee cases were first documented. Why did these deaths cluster so heavily in the hours between midnight and dawn, rather than during the stress of a difficult workday? Why did apparently healthy hearts choose sleep of all states as the moment to fail? The answer, as it turned out, was not that sleep was dangerous in any general sense. It was that for a small specific population carrying this particular genetic vulnerability, the very stillness and vagal calm that makes sleep restorative for nearly everyone else could, under the wrong conditions, become the one condition capable of exposing a flaw that had been sitting quietly in the heart's wiring the entire time, undetected through every ordinary waking hour of that person's life. Fever researchers would later confirm could act as a similar trigger, which helps explain certain historical cases that had puzzled physicians for decades, cases of otherwise healthy people who died during or shortly after a bout of ordinary illness, seemingly for no reason connected to the illness itself. Heavy meals late at night, and in some documented cases even simple electrolyte imbalances from dehydration or excessive alcohol consumption, appeared capable of nudging a vulnerable heart in the same dangerous direction. None of these triggers created the underlying condition. They simply revealed it the way a hairline crack in a piece of glass might remain invisible under ordinary handling and only show itself under one very specific kind of pressure. There is a researcher whose work deserves far more recognition than it generally receives outside of medical anthropology circles. A scholar named Shelley Adler, who spent years in the 1990s conducting deep patient fieldwork within Hmong communities specifically to understand the connection between the folklore of the Dabzog and the documented medical deaths. What Adler found through careful interviews conducted directly with survivors and family members was not a simple case of superstition standing in for ignorance of real cardiology. It was something more layered. She documented that the sleep paralysis experience many Hmong men reported before their deaths. The crushing weight, the sense of a malevolent presence, the inability to move or cry out is itself a well-understood physiologically real phenomenon, one that occurs when a person's mind becomes conscious and alert while their body remains locked in the natural muscular paralysis that ordinarily keeps us from physically acting out our dreams during the deepest stage of sleep. This paralysis, sometimes called sleep atonia, exists in every healthy human being every single night, and it exists for a very good reason. Without it, people would routinely thrash, run, and strike out in their sleep in response to whatever their dreaming mind believed was happening around them. The paralysis is protective. Almost always it lifts smoothly and invisibly as a person wakes with no memory of it ever having been there at all. But occasionally the timing slips. Consciousness returns a few moments before the paralysis has fully released its hold, and the result is a person who is by every meaningful measure fully awake, lying in their own familiar bed and yet completely unable to move a single muscle. Adler's research suggests, and this is a connection she was careful to describe as significant rather than certain. Since the exact physiological chain remains a subject, scholars still debate that the sheer terror of this experience, layered onto men who had already been culturally primed since childhood to interpret it as a genuine and sometimes lethal spiritual attack, may have been capable of producing a surge of stress hormones and nervous system activity severe enough to interact catastrophically with an already vulnerable Brugada-affected heart. In other words, the fear itself may not have simply been a symptom running alongside the real danger. In at least some of these cases, the fear may have been part of the mechanism, a genuinely physiological event triggered by an inherited belief passed down across generations, meeting an inherited cardiac flaw passed down across exactly those same generations in the exact same families on the exact same nights. Is it possible for a belief and a heartbeat to be that intimately connected, for something as intangible as inherited fear to press so directly against something as concrete as an electrical signal in cardiac tissue? The evidence gathered through Adler's work and the cardiology that followed it suggests cautiously that the answer may be closer to yes than 1980s American medicine was ever prepared to consider. None of this fully closes the case, and it is worth being honest about exactly where the certainty ends. Not every documented sudden death within these refugee communities has been definitively linked to Brugada syndrome specifically. Genetic testing on many of the original 1970s and 1980s cases was never possible, since the technology required to identify the syndrome's genetic markers did not yet exist at the time. Most of these men died, and family members who might have carried the same vulnerability were not always tested afterward either, from lack of access to specialized cardiac care or from a reluctance entirely understandable, given everything these families had already endured to revisit a trauma the American medical system had never fully explained to them the first time. What researchers can say with real confidence is that the pattern fits, that the geography fits, that the physiology fits, and that a mystery which had once seemed to belong entirely to folklore now belongs in large part to the quiet, specific, inheritable architecture of the human heart. What remained unresolved by the mid-1990s was not whether something real had been happening to these families. That much by then felt settled. What remained unresolved was what could actually be done about it, whether a condition this quiet, this invisible on an ordinary resting heart scan could ever be reliably caught in a living person, before it had the chance to reach the one moment it seemed to prefer, above all others, the stillness of a body already asleep. A diagnosis that cannot be seen plainly. Sitting quietly on a resting heart scan is in some ways more dangerous than one that announces itself clearly because it allows a family to believe reasonably that all is well. This was the exact problem cardiologists found themselves facing by the mid-1990s once the Brugada brothers had named the syndrome and researchers had begun connecting it cautiously to the pattern of deaths among Hmong refugees and their Southeast Asian relatives further back in history. Knowing a condition exists is not the same as being able to find it inside a specific living, still breathing person, and for years that gap between naming a threat and actually catching it remained frustratingly wide. The difficulty lay in the nature of the electrical signature itself. In many people who carry the genetic vulnerability associated with Brugada syndrome, a standard electrocardiogram performed on an ordinary day in an ordinary doctor's office looks entirely unremarkable. The telltale pattern, the one the Brugada brothers had first identified in that Belgian family, would sometimes appear only intermittently surfacing during fever during certain kinds of physical stress, or seemingly for no traceable reason at all then vanishing again on the very next test. A cardiologist could examine a patient on a Tuesday and see nothing concerning whatsoever, while that same patient's heart under the right conditions on a different night carried a rhythm capable of stopping altogether. To address this, physicians eventually developed what became known as a drug challenge test, deliberately administering a carefully controlled dose of specific sodium channel blocking medications, most commonly a drug called ajmaline, or in some clinical settings flecainide in a hospital setting under close monitoring. These medications, it turned out, could reliably provoke the hidden electrical pattern into revealing itself on the electrocardiogram, essentially forcing a vulnerable heart to show its true face under safe, supervised conditions, rather than waiting for a genuine crisis to do the same thing unsupervised in the dark at home. It is a strange kind of medical logic deliberately stressing a fragile system in order to understand it, but it worked, and it remains even now one of the primary diagnostic tools used to identify the condition in patients whose resting scans look otherwise unremarkable. Diagnosis once achievable opened a second and in some ways more delicate question. What does a doctor actually do for a patient who is found to carry this vulnerability? There is no medication that reliably cures Brugada syndrome, no simple daily pill that closes the small electrical gap in the heart's wiring. For patients considered at meaningfully high risk, the solution that eventually became standard was a small device called an implantable cardioverter defibrillator, a device roughly the size of a pocket watch placed surgically beneath the skin near the collarbone with a thin wire threaded into the heart itself. The device does nothing at all silently for the overwhelming majority of a patient's life. It simply waits, monitoring the heart's rhythm, continuously prepared to deliver a controlled electrical shock in the rare event that it detects the exact kind of chaotic rhythm the condition can produce, essentially standing guard through every one of those vulnerable nighttime hours a person's own body cannot protect itself through alone. For the Hmong families who had lived for over a decade with an explanation rooted entirely in spiritual visitation, the arrival of a genuine medical framework complete with a name, a test, and eventually a device capable of real protection did not simply overwrite what they had believed before. It layered alongside it in ways that researchers working closely with these communities found genuinely moving to witness. Shelley Adler, whose fieldwork we sat with earlier, documented families who continued performing traditional protective rituals before sleep, the same prayers and precautions their parents and grandparents had practiced for generations while also in the same household, accepting cardiac screening and implantable devices for family members identified as carrying the genetic risk. These were not treated as contradictory choices. Within these families, the ritual and the device were understood as two different kinds of protection, aimed at two different aspects of the same real danger, one spiritual and one physical, both taken seriously, both offered without embarrassment or apology. There is a quieter, more surprising layer to this part of the story that rarely makes it into standard medical retellings, and it involves geography rather than genetics. As screening programs expanded through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, researchers began mapping documented and suspected Brugada syndrome cases against historical accounts of Bangungut, Pokkuri and Laitai, stretching back through medical records in the Philippines, Japan, and Thailand across the entire preceding century. What emerged was a rough but genuinely striking correlation regions, with the deepest historical documentation of unexplained nocturnal death syndromes, also showing once modern genetic screening became available meaningfully elevated rates of the specific gene variants associated with Brugada syndrome. The overlap is not perfect, and researchers are careful to note that correlation across such different eras of data collection cannot be treated as definitive proof, but the pattern is difficult to entirely dismiss as coincidence. Could it be that certain regions of Southeast Asia had, for reasons still not fully understood by population geneticists, simply carried a higher concentration of this particular inherited vulnerability for longer than most of the world realized, generation quietly folding into generation, largely unnoticed by anyone outside those communities until war and migration scattered enough of the population widely enough for Western medicine to finally take notice? Why certain genetic variants become more common in some populations than others is itself a complicated question. One population geneticists continue to investigate, and the honest answer is that no single explanation has been fully settled. Some researchers point to random genetic drift within relatively isolated populations over many centuries. Others suggest the variant may counterintuitively have offered some unrelated survival advantage in certain environments, becoming more common not because it was helpful to the heart specifically, but because it travelled alongside some other trait or mutation that was. The evidence remains incomplete, and it may remain incomplete for some time, since studying the deep genetic history of populations that experience significant displacement and loss of records during decades of war is understandably a difficult and sensitive undertaking. What can be said with more confidence is what happened next in terms of the people rather than the genetics, because the story does not end with a diagnosis and a device. It continues into the following decades as the children and grandchildren of the original Hmong refugees who had died in those first frightening years came of age themselves. Many of them now aware of a family history that earlier generations had understood only through prayer and fear, now able to walk into a cardiologist's office and ask plainly whether the same vulnerability that had taken a father or an uncle or a grandfather might be quietly present in their own chest as well. What the Brugada brothers had uncovered in that Belgian family turned out, as cardiologists dug further through the 1990s, to be only one entry in a small, quietly terrifying family of conditions, rather than a single isolated diagnosis standing alone. The heart, it turns out, relies on an extraordinarily precise sequence of electrical signals passing through specialized channels in its cell walls, opening and closing in a rhythm so exact that the entire organ can beat, interrupted several billion times across an average human life without a single meaningful error. When one of those channels carries a genetic flaw, the consequences can take several different forms, depending on exactly which channel is affected and exactly how the flaw disrupts its function. Brugada syndrome was simply the version cardiologists happened to identify first in this particular chapter of medical history, arising specifically in the context of a refugee crisis urgent enough to demand answers. It was not, however, the first of these conditions ever documented. Decades earlier, in 1957, two Norwegian physicians, Anton Jervel and Fred Lange Nielsen, had described a rare inherited condition in children who were born profoundly deaf and who alongside that deafness suffered sudden unexplained fainting spells, some of which ended in sudden death, often during moments of physical exertion or emotional excitement rather than sleep. Years later, researchers would trace this condition, now known as Jervel and Lange Nielsen syndrome, to a flaw in the heart's potassium channels, a cousin of sorts to the sodium channel disruption underlying Brugada syndrome, part of the same broader category of conditions physicians now call cardiac channelopathies, a closely related but more common condition. Long QT syndrome was identified around the same period and would go on to explain a separate, though sometimes overlapping, pattern of sudden death in young people occurring most often during exercise, strong emotion, or in one particular subtype during sleep itself. What is worth sitting with here is how quietly this entire field of medicine had to build itself one small, careful family study at a time, across several decades and several countries, long before anyone thought to connect any of it to the deaths occurring among Hmong refugees in American cities. Medicine, like folklore, does not always travel in straight lines. A discovery made about deaf Norwegian children in the 1950s, a discovery made about a Belgian family with recurring cardiac arrest in the 1980s, and a set of unexplained refugee deaths documented by American public health officials across the same decade sat for years in entirely separate corners of medical literature, written in different journals, read by different specialists before anyone recognized they were in a very real sense, all describing branches of the same underlying tree. There is a name from this same period that deserves its own quiet mention because his work approached the mystery from an entirely different discipline and arrived independently at something remarkably close to the truth. In the 1970s, a folklorist named David Hufford spent years in Newfoundland fishing communities, the same communities where the old hag folklore we sat with earlier had persisted for generations, conducting what was at the time an unusually rigorous piece of research for his field. Rather than treating the old hag accounts as simple superstition to be recorded and set aside, Hufford interviewed hundreds of residents using careful structured methodology, asking detailed questions about exactly what people experienced during these visitations, without ever suggesting to them what answer he expected to hear. What he found was striking in its consistency. Across hundreds of independent interviews, with no coordination between subjects, the physical description of the experience, the paralysis, the crushing chest pressure, the certainty of a malevolent presence in the room, repeated itself with a precision that convinced Hufford something real and physiologically consistent was underlying the folklore, whatever that something turned out to be. His resulting book, published in 1982, argued for what he called the experience-centered approach, treating the folk account as legitimate data about a real phenomenon rather than dismissing it as mere cultural imagination. Scholars still debate how far Hufford's framework should extend, and his work focused on the sleep paralysis experience itself, rather than the separate question of cardiac death, but his research stands in hindsight as one of the earliest serious academic arguments that these ancient, worldwide stories of nighttime visitation were describing something the human body actually does consistently across every culture that has ever tried to put language around it. By the early 2000s, as genetic testing became more widely available and considerably less expensive than it had been even a decade earlier, cardiologists working with Southeast Asian communities in the United States began offering something that would have been unimaginable to the families. Grieving in the early 1980s targeted genetic screening for relatives of anyone who had died suddenly and unexplainably in their sleep. A young man or woman, second generation, born in the United States, raised largely without direct memory of the war or the crossing their parents had survived, could now sit in a cardiologist's office, describe a grandfather or an uncle who had died young and mysteriously decades earlier, and walk out with a simple blood test capable of determining whether that same vulnerability had been passed down into their own chest. Consider what that moment actually involves for a family carrying this particular kind of grief, a death that had gone entirely unexplained for 20, sometimes 30 years, understood only through prayer, through protective ritual, through a stories about a spirit that pressed the breath from a sleeping man, could now finally receive something closer to a name, not always a comforting one. A positive genetic test does not undo a decades-old loss, and it carries its own new weight, the knowledge that a silent risk may be sitting inside one's own heart, inherited quietly alongside eye colour and the shape of a smile. But for many of these families there was something genuinely settling in simply knowing, in having a concrete, testable, medically legible answer to a question that had haunted an entire generation. The evidence remains incomplete on precisely how many of the original Hmong sudden unexpected nocturnal death syndrome cases from the 1970s and 80s would, if fully genetically tested today, turn out to be Brugada syndrome, specifically since many of those original men were buried decades before targeted testing existed, and grief understandably does not always make room for exhumation or genetic reconstruction after so much time has passed. Some researchers estimate the majority of cases likely trace back to Brugada syndrome or a closely related channelopathy. Others caution that a meaningful minority may never be fully explained, that some fraction of these deaths may have arisen from a combination of factors, genetic vulnerability, profound psychological stress, and circumstances of displacement and grief that modern medicine even now struggles to fully untangle from one another. What has changed unmistakably is the direction the fear travels. Where a family in 1981 had almost nowhere to turn, caught between a spiritual explanation their culture understood deeply and in a medical system that offered them nothing but a clean autopsy and a shrug, a family facing the same grief today has an actual concrete path forward, screening, monitoring, and in cases of confirmed risk, a small device capable of standing guard through exactly the hours that had once seemed most dangerous. Is it strange to think that a fear passed down for generations, one so old it had accumulated its own name, its own rituals, its own careful bedtime prayers, might eventually be answered, not by a stronger prayer, but by a device the size of a pocket watch quietly listening to a heartbeat through the night? Strange, perhaps, but not in the end any less remarkable for how ordinary and mechanical the final answer turned out to be. What remains as this story moves toward its final chapters is not simply a matter of medicine settled and folklore explained. It is the quieter, more lasting question of what a community does with the fear that has shaped its bedtime rituals, its prayers, its sense of the dark for generations. Once that fear finally receives a name, it can hold in daylight as well as in the dark. The word ephialtis appears in Greek medical writing more than 2,000 years before anyone in a Belgian cardiology ward ever heard of Brugada syndrome, and it belongs to a physician whose name still echoes through modern medicine in ways most people never notice. Galen, writing in the 2nd century, described a condition he called ephialtes, a Greek word meaning one who leaps upon, used to describe patients who reported waking in the night to a crushing sensation on the chest, an overwhelming sense of suffocation, and a conviction that some external presence had settled onto them while they lay paralyzed and unable to call out. Galen, working centuries before anyone understood the electrical signals of a beating heart, attributed the sensation to disturbed digestion and an imbalance of the body's essential fluids, an explanation that reads today as almost quaint. And yet the description itself, stripped of its ancient medical framework, sits remarkably close to everything we have already traced through Newfoundland, through the Philippines, through the mountains of Laos. This matters because it tells us something important about how far back this experience genuinely reaches, and how little it has ever depended on any single culture, region, or era to produce it. By the time Christian Europe began developing its own elaborate theology around the phenomenon, the vocabulary had shifted, but the underlying account had not. Medieval and early modern clergy across Europe developed detailed doctrine around what they called the incubus and the succubus, demonic spirits believed capable of visiting sleepers in the night, and inquisitorial records from the 15th and 16th centuries contain testimony given under considerable duress, describing encounters that match the old hag phenomenon, almost word for word: the paralysis, the weight, the terror, the certainty that something had entered the room uninvited. The scholars who compiled the notorious Malleus Maleficarum in 1487, a manual intended to guide the identification and prosecution of witches, devoted real attention to these nighttime visitations, treating them not as dreams but as genuine spiritual assault evidence to be taken seriously in a courtroom. It is worth pausing on the weight of that fact rather than moving past it quickly. An experience that modern sleep science now understands as a largely harmless if frightening glitch. In the transition between dreaming and waking consciousness, was for a period of European history treated as legally admissible evidence capable of contributing to accusations that sent real people to real deaths. Historians who study the witch trials still debate exactly how large a role these nighttime experiences played in specific prosecutions, since surviving court records rarely isolate a single cause behind any accusation, and the social and political pressures driving the trials were considerable and varied from town to town. But the overlap between the documented physical description of sleep paralysis and the testimony recorded in numerous surviving trial transcripts is close enough that a number of modern historians and sleep researchers now consider it one meaningful thread among the many that fed those tragedies, a very old, very human, biologically consistent nightmare that a frightened society lacking any other framework chose to explain through accusation rather than compassion. Set against that history, The story of the Hmong refugee community in 1980s America looks in a strange way almost gentle by comparison. Nobody accused these grieving families of witchcraft. Nobody treated the Dabtsog visitations as evidence of wrongdoing. If anything, the American medical establishment's failure was one of a different kind entirely. Not persecution, but a kind of quiet dismissal. A tendency among some early investigators to file the folklore under superstition and move on rather than treating the community's own detailed generational knowledge as the valuable clinical data it actually turned out to be. It took researchers willing to sit patiently inside these communities, people like the medical anthropologists we spent time with earlier, to finally close that gap. That gap closing did not happen quickly, and it did not happen without real friction along the way. Community health workers who lived through the 1980s within Hmong communities in Minnesota, California, and Rhode Island have described in oral histories collected years later a period of considerable mutual frustration. Families who had already survived war displacement and profound cultural upheaval found themselves being asked, sometimes clumsily, to submit loved ones for autopsy, a practice that directly conflicted with traditional Hmong beliefs about honouring the body of the deceased. In traditional Hmong funerary custom, the body is treated with specific careful ritual and the idea of cutting it open for medical examination. However well-intentioned, struck many grieving families as a violation layered directly on top of an already devastating loss. Some families refused autopsies outright. Others agreed only reluctantly, under pressure from public health officials eager to understand a pattern that at the time appeared to be actively killing members of their community at a rate no one could explain or predict. It was in the end largely Hmong community leaders themselves who bridged this divide rather than American medicine bridging it for them. Individuals working within the community, some trained in Western medicine, others respected as traditional healers and elders, began serving as translators in the fullest sense, not simply of language but of entire frameworks of understanding, explaining Western medical concerns to families who had every reason to distrust a system that had in many ways already failed them, while simultaneously explaining to American doctors and public health officials exactly why an autopsy request could not simply be issued the way it might be to any other American family without acknowledgement of what was actually being asked. This slow, patient work of translation carried out, largely without recognition or funding, is arguably as responsible for eventually solving this medical mystery as any single laboratory finding, because without community trust, there would have been no case histories, no family interviews, no willingness to participate in the genetic screening that eventually confirmed the Brugada connection at all. There is a quieter irony sitting inside all of this that deserves its own moment of attention. The very cultural framework that some early American observers dismissed as an obstacle to understanding the Dabtsog folklore, the detailed generational knowledge of warning signs and protective rituals, turned out to be the single most valuable diagnostic tool available to researchers throughout the entire investigation. Every family interview conducted by Shelley Adler and the researchers who followed her depended entirely on families being willing to describe in careful detail exactly what a loved one had reported experiencing in the nights before death, information that existed nowhere in any American medical record, captured only within the oral tradition of the community itself. Western cardiology did not solve this mystery in spite of Hmong folklore. It solved it in no small part because that folklore had been quietly, carefully cataloguing symptoms for generations before anyone thought to ask. What survives from this period beyond the medical literature and the genetic screening programs it eventually produced is a small number of institutions built specifically because of what these families endured. Community health organizations founded by and for Hmong Americans in the years following the crisis, several of which remain active today, trace their origins directly back to this era. born from the recognition that a community carrying this much collective trauma and this specific inherited medical vulnerability needed resources that mainstream American healthcare at the time simply was not equipped to provide. Culturally informed genetic counseling, bilingual cardiac screening programs and training for Western physicians on how to conduct a respectful, trust-building conversation with a Hmong family, navigating both grief and unfamiliar medical terminology all developed, gradually out of lessons learned during these difficult early years. None of this fully closes the emotional distance between a family in 1981 watching a healthy young husband go to bed and never wake again with absolutely no explanation available to them, and a family today equipped with genetic testing, cardiac monitoring, and a name for what they are facing. Grief does not move in a straight line simply because medicine eventually catches up to it. Many of the wives and mothers who lived through the original wave of deaths carried decades of unanswered fear before any of this understanding arrived, and for some of them the science came too late to offer anything but a delayed partial kind of peace and explanation for a loss that had already reshaped the rest of their lives. Is there something to be learned, though, in simply noticing how long this fear had been travelling before medicine finally caught up to it, moving quietly across centuries and continents through Greek medical texts and inquisitorial courtrooms and Newfoundland fishing villages and refugee apartments in the American Midwest, always describing in its own local language the same underlying truth? A body at its most vulnerable in the stillness of sleep, sometimes betrayed by something ancient and inherited hidden, so deep inside its own wiring that it would take science the better part of 2,000 years to finally see it clearly. What remains ahead of us now is not another culture's version of the same fear, but the far more personal, far more universal question. This story has been circling from the very beginning. The question of what any of us actually owe the people we love once we understand that some dangers cannot be seen coming and can only be watched for quietly together through the hours when we are least able to watch for them ourselves. A little more than a decade before the Belgian brothers who would eventually name Brugada syndrome were even born, a different kind of sleep-related mystery was already unfolding across the hospitals of Europe. One so strange, so specific, and so devastating that it remains even now one of the least understood epidemics in modern medical history. It has no direct genetic connection to anything we have discussed so far, and that is precisely why it belongs here, because it reminds us that sleep has offered up more than one unsolved mystery to medicine, and that the fear of dying or disappearing into one's own rest has haunted more than a single community in a single decade. In the winter of 1916, a Viennese neurologist named Konstantin von Economo began noticing an unusual cluster of patients arriving at his clinic exhibiting symptoms he had never encountered before in any textbook or lecture hall. These patients were in the most literal sense imaginable falling asleep and simply not waking up in any ordinary way. Some slipped into a profound, unshakable drowsiness that deepened over days or weeks until they could no longer be roused at all, drifting from natural sleep into something closer to a coma from which a meaningful number never recovered. Von Economo gave the condition a name, encephalitis lethargica, and within a few short years it had spread far beyond Vienna, appearing in hospitals across Europe, North America, and eventually much of the world, ultimately affecting, by conservative historical estimates, somewhere close to 1 million people before it mysteriously receded in the late 1920s, nearly as suddenly as it had arrived. What made encephalitis lethargica so unsettling beyond its sheer scale was the strange range of outcomes it produced in the people it touched. A meaningful portion of those affected died, often quietly sinking deeper and deeper into sleep until their breathing simply stopped, their families left, much like the families we have already spent considerable time with, staring at a healthy relative gone, still with no clear explanation available to the physicians treating them. But a significant number of patients did not die. They survived the acute illness only to be left in an entirely different and in some ways more haunting condition. Many entered estate doctors of the period struggled to describe with any real precision a kind of waking stillness, minds seemingly present behind unmoving faces, bodies locked in place for months, sometimes years, sometimes, as would eventually become clear, for decades. It is worth pausing to sit with exactly how frightening this must have been for the families living through it in real time, in an era with none of the diagnostic tools we take for granted today. Imagine a young mother in London or Philadelphia in the spring of 1919, watching her otherwise healthy husband grow steadily more tired over the course of a week, until one morning he simply cannot be woken at all. His breathing slow but steady, his body warms, his eyes sometimes fluttering open without any recognition behind them. No infection anyone can identify with the laboratory tools available at the time. No wound, no fever, any physician can point to as an obvious cause. Just a slow, terrifying slide into a sleep that refuses to end. And for those who survived that acute phase, sometimes an even stranger fate waiting on the other side of it. A kind of living stillness that doctors at the time had genuinely no framework for treating or even fully understanding. The cause of encephalitis lethargica remains even now a subject scholars still debate rather than a settled historical fact, which is itself a remarkable admission for a disease that affected roughly 1 million people within a span of little more than a decade. The timing of the outbreak arriving in close proximity to the devastating influenza pandemic of 1918 led many physicians of the era to assume the two were directly connected, variations of the same underlying viral assault on the body. Later researchers grew skeptical of that connection, noting differences in how the two illnesses actually behaved and spread, and some modern researchers have proposed instead that encephalitis lethargica may have been an autoimmune reaction, the body's own immune system triggered by an earlier and otherwise unremarkable strep infection, mistakenly attacking specific structures deep within the brain responsible for regulating sleep and wakefulness. Neither explanation has ever been definitively proven, and the disease largely vanished from the world before modern virology and immunology possessed the tools required to settle the question with any real confidence, leaving one of the 20th century's largest medical mysteries permanently, frustratingly just out of reach. There is a quieter thread to this story that deserves its own moment because it eventually intersected with the wider culture in a way few obscure 1920s epidemics ever do. Among the small number of encephalitis lethargica survivors who remained in that strange, frozen waking stillness for decades afterward, a group came under the care in the late 1960s of a young neurologist working at a chronic care hospital in the Bronx named Oliver Sacks. Sacks, treating patients who had been essentially unreachable since the 1920s, made the remarkable decision to try a then experimental medication called levodopa on them, a drug being developed at the time primarily for Parkinson's disease. The results when they came were nothing short of extraordinary. A number of these patients, some of whom had not spoken or moved with intention in over 40 years, began gradually and then in some cases quite suddenly to wake. Sacks would later describe these events in his book Awakenings, published in 1973, offering the wider public one of its only real glimpses into just how devastating and just how strange this largely forgotten sleep epidemic had actually been for the people who lived through its longest, most silent chapter. Why does this belong in the same story as the Hmong refugee deaths and the discovery of Brugada syndrome when the two conditions share no medical connection whatsoever? Because together they tell us something honest about how differently sleep can betray a person, and how many separate, unrelated ways the human body has found to fail in the dark across even a single century of recorded medical history. One condition lived quietly in the heart's electrical wiring, inherited silently across generations, waiting for the particular stillness of deep sleep to expose itself. Another arrived seemingly from nowhere in the aftermath of the deadliest flu pandemic in recorded history, attacking the brain's own machinery for regulating consciousness itself, then disappearing almost as mysteriously as it came, leaving behind survivors trapped in a stillness modern medicine would not learn to partially reverse for another 40 years. Sleep, it turns out, offers the body more than one door through which real danger can enter, and history has been forced to solve each one separately, often decades apart, often by entirely different branches of medicine, working with no awareness that they were in their own way, chasing variations of the same ancient human fear. What both stories share in the end, despite everything that separates them medically, is the shape of the grief they left behind. A family watching a healthy loved one slip away into sleep and simply not return with no name available yet for what had taken them, experienced something remarkably similar, whether they were living in a refugee apartment in Minnesota in 1981 or a row house in Philadelphia in 1919. The specific cause differed, the particular helplessness did not. There is one more historical figure worth introducing here, because his work, unlike Sachs or the Brugada brothers, approached the broader question of nighttime death from an entirely different angle, one rooted not in cardiology or neurology but in the emerging field of sleep medicine itself. In the 1950s, physiologist Nathaniel Kleitman, working at the University of Chicago alongside his graduate student Eugene Aserinsky, made the discovery that sleep was not the single, uniform state most people, including most physicians, had long assumed it to be. Their research identified distinct stages within a single night's sleep, including the period we now know as rapid eye movement sleep, the stage most closely associated with vivid dreaming, and as later researchers would establish, the very muscular paralysis responsible for so much of the old hag folklore. We sat with several parts ago. Kleitman's work, largely unconnected at the time to any of the sudden death mysteries we have followed, nonetheless laid the entire scientific foundation that would eventually allow later researchers to understand exactly why nighttime, and specifically certain stages within nighttime, carried such particular physiological risk for hearts and brains already carrying some hidden vulnerability. It is a strange thing to realize, sitting with all of this together, that the 20th century essentially had to build the entire science of sleep from scratch, discovering its stages, its electrical patterns, its strange muscular paralysis, its capacity to both restore and occasionally betray the body resting within it, largely in parallel with rather than in direct service of the specific mysteries we have spent so much of tonight following. Kleitman was not trying to explain Hmong refugee deaths when he identified rapid eye movement sleep in a University of Chicago laboratory. Von Economo was not thinking about Belgian cardiology when he first described a strange sleeping sickness moving through Vienna, and yet each of these separate threads, pursued for their own reasons, in their own decades by researchers who in most cases never met one another or read each other's work, eventually wove together into something close to a genuine working understanding of why the human body is so reliable, through every waking hour of an ordinary life, occasionally chooses the stillness of sleep as the moment to fail. What remains as we move toward the closing chapters of tonight's story is not another disease, another syndrome, another decade of fear. It is the question of what all of this ultimately came to mean for the people who lived closest to it, the families who buried loved ones without answers, the researchers who spent careers chasing a pattern across continents and centuries, and the quiet, lasting changes that finally emerged from all that searching. Changes that continue even now to protect hearts that would otherwise never know the danger they were carrying until it was already too late to matter. A death certificate that reads, "Simply cause unknown, does something quietly cruel to the people left behind it beyond the obvious grief." It closes a door where families desperately need one left open, and for much of the 20th century that particular door closed on far more families than just the Hmong communities we have spent so much of tonight with. As genetic cardiology matured through the 1990s and into the 2000s, researchers began returning to old case files scattered across entirely different countries and entirely different decades and found the same quiet pattern waiting for them almost everywhere they looked. In Ireland, cardiologists working through medical examiner records in the 1990s began noticing their own long, largely unexamined history of young, healthy people, disproportionately young men in their teens and 20s, dying suddenly with no cause an autopsy could identify. Unlike the American cases, these were not concentrated within a single immigrant community. They were scattered across the general population, individual tragedies that had for decades been treated as isolated and unconnected, filed under vague or incomplete causes of death precisely because no one had yet built the framework required to recognize them as part of a pattern at all. It took the emergence of Brugada syndrome and the broader category of cardiac channelopathies to give Irish cardiologists a lens through which these older cases suddenly made a different kind of sense. The condition acquired its own name within general non-refugee populations around this time. Sudden arrhythmic death syndrome, a clinical label essentially describing the same underlying mystery we have followed since that first apartment in the early 1980s, a structurally normal heart that simply stops in a person with no prior diagnosis, most often while at rest or asleep. This reframing mattered enormously because it revealed something that had been easy to miss while the story remained anchored specifically to one refugee community's experience. The vulnerability sitting inside certain hearts was never exclusively a Southeast Asian phenomenon, even if certain genetic variants did appear with greater frequency in populations tracing their ancestry to that region. It was and remains a vulnerability capable of appearing quietly within families of nearly any background, waiting sometimes for generations for the right combination of circumstances to reveal itself. Families in Ireland, in the United Kingdom, in Scandinavia, and eventually across much of the world began recognizing their own decades-old unexplained losses inside a diagnostic framework that had in a very real sense been built first through the patient. Careful work done alongside Hmong families in American clinics a decade or more earlier. Out of this recognition came a wave of advocacy that rarely receives much attention outside cardiology circles, but that quietly reshaped how sudden unexplained death is investigated across much of the developed world. Grieving families, many of whom had spent years being told there was simply nothing more medicine could tell them, began organizing support and research organizations of their own, pushing for what eventually became standard practice in a growing number of countries: mandatory genetic testing and family screening following any sudden unexplained death in a person under the age of 40. Ireland's own sudden cardiac death awareness efforts, alongside similar organizations that emerged in the United Kingdom and later in the United States, helped push forward what researchers now call the molecular autopsy, a process in which tissue samples preserved from a deceased person can be genetically screened, sometimes even years after death, to identify inherited channelopathies that a traditional physical autopsy would never detect on its own. The molecular autopsy deserves a moment of real attention because it represents perhaps the single most direct legacy connecting everything we have followed tonight to the actual present-day medicine now protecting living families, where the physicians investigating the earliest Hmong deaths in the 1980s had almost nothing beyond a physical examination table and a set of increasingly frustrated questions a medical examiner today faced with an unexplained sudden death in a young, healthy person can preserve genetic material specifically for this kind of analysis, screening directly for the sodium and potassium channel. Mutations associated with Brugada syndrome, long QT syndrome, and several related conditions. When a mutation is identified, it does not simply close the file on the person who's already died. It opens immediately a path toward testing every living relative who shares that person's bloodline, transforming a single unexplained tragedy into an early warning system for an entire family that might otherwise have had no reason to suspect anything was wrong until it was too late for one of them as well. How many lives has this quiet shift into medical practice actually saved? The honest answer is that no one can offer a precise number, and researchers are careful about that uncertainty rather than smoothing over it, since the counterfactual, all the sudden deaths that never happened because a family member was identified, monitored, and protected in time, is by its nature invisible, impossible to count directly. What can be measured, and what several long-term cardiology studies have documented since the practice became more widespread, is a marked increase in the number of at-risk relatives identified and successfully treated. In the years since molecular autopsy protocols were adopted, alongside a corresponding rise in preventive device implantation among family members who a generation earlier would have had absolutely no reason to suspect their own hearts carried any hidden risk at all. There is a particular kind of quiet justice in recognizing where this entire chain of discovery actually began, because it did not begin in a well-funded European research hospital, and it did not begin with an already prestigious medical specialty eager to expand its reach. It began with a grieving, displaced refugee community dismissed by parts of the medical establishment as offering little beyond folklore, whose patient insistence on the reality of what they were witnessing, combined with researchers willing to actually listen to them rather than pass them, ultimately helped build a diagnostic framework now protecting families with no connection whatsoever to Laos, to the Mekong crossing, or to the Dab Tsog their grandparents had once prayed against each night. Something worth sitting with quietly is how often the most significant medical discoveries begin exactly this way. Not in the places already equipped with resources and attention, but in the places carrying the deepest, most immediate need to understand what was happening to them. By the early 2010s, screening programs modelled at least partly on lessons learned during the original Hmong investigations had extended into an area few of the original researchers could have anticipated decades earlier: competitive athletics. Sudden cardiac death occurring during intense physical exertion in young athletes. A tragedy that had appeared periodically throughout the 20th century with no consistent explanation, began receiving the same genetic scrutiny once reserved almost exclusively for unexplained nighttime deaths. Several professional sports organizations and university athletic programs across Europe and the United States began incorporating cardiac screening, including electrocardiogram analysis capable of flagging the same subtle Brugada pattern the Belgian brothers had first identified in that grieving family decades earlier, into standard pre-season medical evaluations, catching, in a meaningful number of documented cases, exactly the kind of silent vulnerability that had once revealed itself only in death. What connects a promising young athlete collapsing on a field in broad daylight to a Hmong refugee found still in his bed before dawn in 1981 is not obvious at first glance. Separated as they are by decades, by circumstance, by the very different worlds each of these people inhabited. And yet underneath both tragedies sits the exact same quiet inherited flaw in the heart's electrical architecture, waiting in each case for the right combination of stress and stillness to finally reveal itself. Medicine's growing ability to recognize that connection across such wildly different contexts stands as one of the more genuinely remarkable achievements to emerge from this entire story, one that began in fear and folklore and grief, and gradually patiently reshaped how the world understands one of its oldest and most universal terrors. What remains as we move closer to the end of tonight's journey together is not another discovery or another decade of research. It is the far quieter, far more personal question of what it actually meant for the specific families who lived through the earliest and most frightening years of this story to finally watch their private grief become part of something the rest of the world had at last learned to take seriously. There is a woman named Zhao Wang whose story researchers documented in the years following the original wave of deaths, and who spent decades carrying a particular kind of loneliness that this history helps explain even if it can never fully undo it. She lost her husband in 1982 in exactly the manner we have described so many times tonight. A healthy man in his early 30s, a quiet groan in the night that woke no one enough to act, and a stillness by morning that no doctor could explain. She raised their children largely alone in a country she had lived in for barely 3 years at the time of his death, carrying both an ordinary widow's grief and an extraordinary unanswerable fear. The sense that something had specifically targeted her family, something she could neither name to her American neighbors nor fully explain to her own children as they grew older, in a place so far from the mountains where this fear had first taken shape. What researchers who eventually located and interviewed women like her decades later found again and again was not simply relief at finally receiving a scientific explanation, though that relief was real and often profound. They found something more complicated sitting alongside it, a kind of grief that had in a sense aged without ever fully resolving decades of private fear, that a name and a diagnosis arriving so many years after the fact could acknowledge but never entirely soften. One woman interviewed as part of a later academic study into the long-term impact of these deaths on surviving Hmong families described the eventual medical explanation as something like finally being believed, a phrase that researchers working across trauma and grief studies have noted carries its own particular weight distinct from simple relief. She had known, she said all along, that something real had taken her husband. What she had lacked for 20 years was anyone outside in her own community willing to say so plainly. This distinction between already knowing something and finally being believed sits at the emotional center of everything we have followed tonight, and it deserves to be named directly rather than left implicit. The Hmong families who lived through these deaths were never actually confused about what was happening to them. Their explanation, rooted in the Dabtsog and generations of careful observation, was detailed, internally consistent, and, as later genetic research would confirm, remarkably close to an accurate description of a real physical danger. What these families lacked was not understanding. It was standing in the fullest sense of that word. The kind of institutional acknowledgement that transforms a community's private knowledge into something the wider world is finally willing to take seriously, fund research toward and build protective medicine around. There is a broader pattern worth sitting with here, one that extends well beyond this particular story though. This story illustrates it with unusual clarity. Scholars who study the history of medicine still debate how many other folk traditions around the world, traditions dismissed for generations as superstition by outside observers, may be quietly encoding real, careful generational observation of genuine physical phenomena that modern science has simply not yet caught up to identifying. This is not a claim that every piece of folklore hides a hidden scientific truth waiting to be discovered, and reputable researchers are careful never to suggest that. Most folklore remains exactly what it appears to be, a culture's imaginative response to the uncertainties of existence. But the Dabtsog case stands as a genuine, well-documented example of the opposite. Also being true sometimes of a tradition that looked from the outside like superstition and turned out, on close and respectful examination, to be something closer to an early informal epidemiological record refined across generations by people paying very careful attention to a real and recurring danger in their own community. The children of the men who died in those first frightening years are by now largely adults themselves, many with children of their own. and their relationship to this history carries its own particular texture, different again from their mother's generation. Several of the researchers who conducted longer-term studies into Hmong American health outcomes through the 2000s and 2010s noted a recurring theme in interviews with this younger generation, a sense of inherited vigilance rather than inherited fear exactly, where their mothers had lived through the original terror. With no explanation available at all, many of these adult children grew up knowing from a relatively young age that their family carried a specific nameable cardiac risk, one that could be tested for monitored and in confirmed cases protected against with real medical intervention. For some, this knowledge became simply another item on a list of family medical history discussed matter-of-factly at holiday gatherings alongside diabetes risk or high blood pressure, the same way any American family might discuss an inherited condition running through several generations. For others, the inheritance carries more weight than that a quiet awareness some described in interviews of representing a kind of living continuation of everything. Their parents and grandparents survived the war, the crossing, the refugee camps, the unexplained deaths, and now finally an actual answer that arrived only after so much had already been lost. One man, the son of a father who died of sudden nocturnal death syndrome in 1983 when the son himself was only 4 years old, described in a later interview the strange experience of undergoing genetic testing himself as an adult and testing negative for the relevant Brugada mutation, a result that brought him profound relief for his own health and his own children's futures alongside a separate, harder-to-articulate grief. The realization that whatever had actually taken his father, in the end would likely never be confirmed with total certainty since his father's own genetic material had never been preserved for testing at the time of his death. Scholars who study grief across generations note that this particular kind of unresolved not knowing, even amid genuine scientific progress, remains common among families connected to the earliest, least documented cases from this period. A reminder that even a story with as much genuine resolution as this one carries, strands that history will likely never fully be able to tie off. What can be said with real confidence sitting at some distance from those individual family stories is how significantly medicine's overall relationship to unexplained sudden death has shifted because of everything set in motion by this particular community's suffering. Before the 1980s, a family facing a sudden unexplained death in an otherwise healthy relative had in most parts of the world essentially nowhere to turn beyond grief itself. Today, in a growing number of countries, that same family has access to genetic counseling, molecular autopsy family cardiac screening, and when warranted protective devices capable of standing guard against a threat that would otherwise remain completely invisible until it was too late. None of this erases what happened to the original families who lived through this crisis with none of these tools available to them. But it means that their suffering and their patient, generous willingness to be interviewed, tested and studied by researchers who were in many cases complete strangers to their culture and their grief became something larger than any single family's private tragedy. It became the foundation of protection now extending to families with no connection whatsoever to Laos or the Mekong or those first frightening years in unfamiliar American apartments. There is one final piece of this legacy worth naming, quieter than the medical advances, but perhaps just as significant in its own way. Several Hmong community organizations that trace their founding directly back to this period continue even now to train new generations of bilingual health workers specifically to help bridge exactly the kind of gap that cost so much time and understanding in those earliest years. Their work extends today well beyond cardiac health alone, into general health care access, mental health support for a community still carrying multi-generational trauma from war and displacement and ongoing genetic research into other conditions that may, like Brugada syndrome, once did be hiding in plain sight within a community's own careful generational knowledge, waiting only for someone with the right tools and the right patience to finally take that knowledge seriously enough to listen. What remains now as this long night story approaches its final quiet hour is not another discovery, another family, or another decade to trace. It is simply the space to sit together with everything this particular history has actually shown us about fear, about inheritance, about the long, strange, patient path a truth sometimes has to walk before the world is finally ready to receive it. There is one particular archive worth returning to before we let this story rest, a small collection of interviews recorded in the late 1990s by researchers working with Hmong elders across Minnesota and California, most of whom have since passed away themselves, taking with them the last living first-hand memory of what those early years actually felt like from the inside. Among those recordings sits a brief exchange with an elderly shaman, a man who had spent decades performing protective rituals for families frightened of the Dabtatsog long before any of them had ever heard the words sodium channel or genetic mutation. Asked gently what he made of the new medical explanation now that Western doctors had finally identified something they called Brugada syndrome, he did not dismiss it, and he did not defer to it entirely either. He said through a translator that the doctors had found the mechanism. He had always known the danger. Sit with that answer for a moment because it holds in a single unhurried sentence nearly everything this story has been quietly trying to say across everything we have followed together tonight. Two systems of knowledge, one built from prayer and careful generational observation, the other built from electrocardiograms and genetic sequencing, arrived eventually at the same understanding of the same real danger, each using the only tools available to the people who developed them. Neither was wrong, neither was complete without the other. It took a grieving, displaced community willing to speak honestly with strangers about their deepest fears, and a small number of researchers willing to actually listen rather than explain, to finally bring those two kinds of knowing into the same room. This is when you step back far enough from the specific details of very old human story wearing modern clothes. Long before anyone could name a heart's electrical wiring, before anyone had a word for a gene or a mutation, human beings were already doing the patient work of survival, noticing patterns, passing warnings down through families, building small rituals of protection around dangers they could feel but not yet fully explain. The Dabtsog and the Old Hag and Galen's Ephialtes were never simply stories told to frighten children before bed. They were something closer to memory itself, a community's collective, careful record of a real threat carried forward across centuries by people who had no other way to preserve what they had learned except to keep telling it generation after generation in the dark until someone finally arrived with the instruments capable of proving they'd been right all along. There is something worth holding on to in the fact that the answer, when it finally came, arrived not from power or prestige but from patience. It did not come from the wealthiest hospitals or the most celebrated researchers acting alone. It came from a grieving refugee community in unfamiliar American cities telling the truth of their own experience to anyone willing to sit long enough to hear it, and from a small number of physicians and anthropologists in Belgium, in Newfoundland, in Minnesota, in the Philippines, each pulling on their own separate thread of the same tangled mystery, none of them fully aware for years that they were all reaching toward the same conclusion from entirely different directions. History rarely resolves itself through a single dramatic breakthrough. More often it resolves the way this one did, slowly across decades through the accumulated patience of people who kept paying attention long after it would have been easier to look away. What this story leaves us with in the end is not really about hearts or genes or even sleep itself, though all of those things carried us here. It is about what a community does with a truth it holds but cannot yet prove, and what it costs to wait, sometimes for generations, for the rest of the world to finally catch up. The Hmong families who lived through those first frightening years in the early 1980s were never confused about what was happening to them. They understood with real clarity that something dangerous was moving through their community in the night. What they lacked was not knowledge. It was a language the wider world was prepared to believe. And that gap between knowing something true and being able to make others recognize it as true may be one of the oldest and most quietly painful gaps in the entire history of human understanding present in this story and present, if we are honest, in countless others like it that have never received the same careful attention. It is worth remembering, too, how ordinary the people at the center of this story actually were, because history so often preserves only the extraordinary. The kings, the generals, the famous names attached to famous discoveries. The people who mattered most here were for the most part quite ordinary. A young husband settling into an unfamiliar apartment. A wife who never stopped believing her own account of what had happened, even when no one outside her community would listen. A shaman performing the same protective ritual his own teacher had taught him decades earlier, an anthropologist willing to spend years simply sitting with families and asking careful, respectful questions rather than arriving with conclusions already formed. None of them set out to make medical history. They were simply trying to survive, to understand, to protect the people they loved, using whatever tools and whatever knowledge happened to be available to them at the time. That, more than any single scientific breakthrough, may be the truest thread running through this entire story, the quiet, persistent effort of ordinary people trying to make sense of something frightening and real long before anyone with more authority was willing to take them seriously. The slow work continues even now in ways that rarely make headlines. Researchers continue refining genetic screening for cardiac channelopathies. Community health workers, many of them the grandchildren of the original refugees, continue building bridges between traditional knowledge and modern medicine in clinics across the country. Families continue discovering, sometimes decades after a loss, that a grandfather or an uncle who died mysteriously in 1982 might finally have an explanation arriving far too late to offer comfort in the moment it was needed, but perhaps just in time to protect someone still living. And now let the pace of the story slow the way it always must toward the end of a long night. Sleep has always asked something of us that almost nothing else does. A complete surrender. A willingness to let the mind go dark, to let the body rest entirely undefended. Trusting that morning will simply arrive the way it always has. For most of human history, that trust has been well placed. It still is for the overwhelming majority of people on the overwhelming majority of nights. But every so often across every culture and every century, someone has noticed that the trust does not always hold. A weight on the chest that should not be there. A silence in a room that lasts a little too long. A grief that arrives with no explanation attached to it at all. What this particular story shows us, if it shows us anything, is that even the oldest fears usually carry some thread of truth inside them, waiting patiently to be recognized. The old hag was never simply superstition. The dabtsog was never simply folklore. They were the careful, imperfect language of people trying to describe something they could feel long before they had the words or the instruments to prove it. Somewhere tonight, in a quiet bedroom on the other side of the world from where this story began, a small device the size of a pocket watch sits beneath someone's collarbone, doing nothing at all, waiting patient and silent the way it has waited every night since it was placed there. It does not know the history behind it. It does not know about a village in Laos or a mountain crossing, or a shaman's prayer, or a grieving widow who spent 20 years being told there was simply nothing more anyone could tell her. It simply listens quietly to a single heartbeat, ready to answer if that heartbeat ever falters. And somewhere else tonight, in a house far from any hospital, an old ritual is still being spoken softly before bed. The same words a grandmother once spoke, the same words her own mother spoke before her carried forward, not because anyone still needs proof that it works, but because some forms of love simply insist on being passed down, generation after generation, whether or not the world ever fully understands why. Two kinds of protection, two kinds of memory, both still watching over the same quiet dark. Rest now. You're not the mayor's next visit. You're only someone warm and safe listening to an old story about the night drifting at last, toward a morning that will come exactly the way it always has.